Thank you, everyone. It's good to see you all. Let's go ahead and get settled. It's a lovely night to meditate. I don't know where you are, Heather, but over here it's kind of rainy and cold. It's a good night to be indoors and still. And settle into the moment by taking a couple deep breaths. And just let any tension you feel drain away to whatever extent you can. This next half hour is a time for letting go of the things that you might have brought with you into meditation. There's no need to push them away, but there's no need for them to be here either. As you're resting in the present moment, you might let the sensations of the breath come to mind. You might notice that the sensations simply arise on their own without you needing to do anything. You might notice where they arise. Perhaps they arise at the nostrils, or in the belly, or the chest, or the throat. Just let them arise and change and pass away all on their own. And when the mind wanders, when it finds some other object interesting, they get lost in the story, you might very gently bring it back to the breath. There's no need for any kind of upset or discomfort. The mind is made to do that sort of thing. Just very gently bring it back to the breath. Kindness. Breathing in and letting the sensation of the breath be fully known. And breathing out and letting the sensations of the breath be fully known. And if there is some stability to the mind, you might see if you can know the breath even more clearly. Notice any little details which may have escaped your attention. Notice just exactly how the breath moves, what it feels like. Is the mind lost in story at the moment? So that's okay. The mind does that sort of thing. Just let it come back to the breath with kindness and gentleness. And so tonight, there's a particular aspect of the breath that I'd like to explore. You might notice that the breath is always changing. It's never the same. You might notice that the shape of this current breath is different than the shape of the last breath. You might go a bit deeper, a bit shallower. You might fill the lungs in a different way. The physical sensations are always different, always changing. You might see if you can notice that. You might also notice that the breath is not one single sensation, but many different sensations. For me, I notice that the breath is comprised of temperature at the nostrils. It's cold on the in breath and warmer on the out breath. And further in, there's a kind of vibratory quality to the breath. As it gets down in my lungs and stomach, it becomes more of a solid pressure. Feels like a cloud. Yours may feel different, but you might see if you can see what the breath is made of, what different kinds of sensations. You might take that idea of the breath being comprised of multiple different sensations rather than simply one big breath. You might take that idea and see how deep that goes. You might see how many little pieces the breath can break into. The number can get very high if you let it. And see the breath in a great deal of detail. And see it as an image with many little pixels to it, or a symphony with many notes. Let's see if it's possible to perceive the breath that way. In these last few minutes, you might let go of the breath if you like. And just bring to mind some gratitude towards yourself for doing this practice that leads to the end of suffering. It's a great gift to you and to those around you. You might reflect on that for a few moments. Thank you all for sitting with me. All right, so for the next few weeks, I'd like to talk about what are called the three marks of existence, or the three characteristics: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. They're often translated as impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, or suffering, and not self. And the three characteristics are something that applies to everything in our experience, everything that arises and passes away. All that we experience is subject to the three characteristics. And the important thing about them is we habitually misunderstand these things. We habitually misunderstand the world as comprising stable, solid objects, as comprising things that are capable of giving us lasting happiness. And we habitually misunderstand the world as in terms of things that are me and things that are not me. So understanding them correctly is it's really the fruition of the path. So it's a useful thing to work towards. But tonight I'm just going to talk about anicca. I'll hope to do the other two in following weeks. And some of the Pali words don't have very good definitions to them or very good English translations, but translating anicca as impermanence is pretty good. It's a good translation. You can also think of maybe evanescence, or something that has connotations of instability or inconstantness. Of the three characteristics, anicca is kind of unique in that we all seem to acknowledge it. If you go and talk to somebody on the street, even somebody who's not a Buddhist, if you ask them, do things change? Of course, they're going to answer yes. And this is true even about the important things, the things that it's difficult to come to terms with. If you ask this person on the street, are you going to die? Are you going to get sick or get ill? Of course, they would answer yes too. If you ask them the same question about the people they care about, they would still answer yes, I would think. And I wouldn't think that's true of dukkha or anatta. So we all seem to have some understanding of impermanence, and that to my mind makes it an easier gateway into understanding these three characteristics. We all have a kind of intellectual understanding of the idea that things are going to change. What we don't often have is a kind of subconscious or gut feeling about this. We at a kind of deep level, we don't understand impermanence fully, and that's where the suffering comes from. We much of the things that we do and our actions and our behavior is born out of that subconscious understanding of the world, and not so much our intellectual knowledge about how things are. So I thought I would try and do a little bit of a visualization to understand why we have this misunderstanding of the world. In one sense we do see it clearly, but in another sense we don't. I'd like to try and explain what happens. So if you want to close your eyes, maybe that would help. And you might imagine that you are sitting outside, and perhaps in the foreground there's a meadow with some tall grass. Maybe in the background there's a forest with lots of trees. And the scene is in motion. Let's add some wind to it. The grass is swaying back and forth, as are the leaves and the trees. And perhaps there's animals running about, deer or foxes or whatever. Just clouds in the sky and birds flying around. The kind of key feature I'm trying to get across is that everything is in motion. Nothing is static or still or stable or solid. Everything is in flux. You might add one more piece to this visualization. You might imagine that instead of sitting outside, you're viewing this through a big glass window. The world outside is the world as it really is. It's the world of direct experience, the world where everything is in motion and flux. But that world it's not so helpful to the mind for maybe a reason we'll get into later. It's not too helpful for the mind in order to understand things. And so what the mind does is it constructs its own world. In this analogy, it picks out the patterns in the scene it sees. Perhaps it identifies a tree or something. And then it draws that pattern on the pane of glass with maybe a dry erase marker. And it fills up the whole window this way. It draws, it takes the patterns it sees in the world outside and it creates objects out of them. It makes little drawings. And this world is the world that we spend most of our time in, the constructed world, this world of drawings. This is helpful to the mind because when objects are solid, as they are on the pane of glass, they can be understood, and you can make connections between objects. You can have different characteristics about these objects, and you can plan, and you can understand how to manipulate them in ways that you want, which you can't do with the world of direct experience, the world that's always in motion, the world without static objects. So that's what the mind does. We mostly interact with the world that we construct, the drawings on the glass wall. And the issue with that is that these drawings are not perfect representations of the world as it really is. Our drawings aren't particularly good, and they don't reflect the changing nature of the world. And that difference is where dukkha comes in, when we understand the world to be one way when it's actually another. That's where suffering arises. And that dichotomy between, or that duality between the world the world of direct experience and the world on the glass window, it's sometimes referred to as the relative perspective versus the ultimate perspective. You might have heard the world of form versus the world of emptiness. I like to look at it as the world of nouns versus the world of verbs, right? The world of objects versus the world in motion. That seems an easier way to understand it to me. So that's what we do. And our practice is to learn to see through this glass window, to see through to the world as it really is. And we do this in the present moment. In every moment, there is impermanence there to be seen, and we can find it and see it and know it fully, and so as to train our mind to see things from that perspective. I like to think of impermanence as having different flavors or different aspects. You can talk about spatial impermanence, which is my term. We might have the idea that the body is this one solid piece, but when you think about it, the body is comprised of different things. It's comprised of eyes and a brain and bones and muscle and skin and all sorts of things. All those things are comprised of cells, and cells are comprised of little pieces of cellular machinery, and those things are comprised of proteins, which are comprised of molecules and atoms and subatomic particles. Even the very smallest particles, my understanding of how physicists see the world is that particles are not actually understood to be there. They're just kind of a sort of mental, like an easy kind of mental representation to understand what are actually fields. So this body that feels like one solid object is not. And that's true of any physical object. This whole world is made of things that we take to be solid objects that are not. It's true of mental phenomena too, which is the point I was trying to get at with the meditation. The breath may have at one point seem like a solid object to you, but it's actually comprised of many different sensations, and you can go quite deep in that, and that can be like many, many, many sensations. And so everything is impermanent in that way, in the kind of spatial sense. You can also talk about temporal impermanence. It's my term again. Thich Nhat Hanh has a kind of famous teaching where he holds up this. He will ask somebody in the audience, "What do you see?" And somebody will invariably say, "I see a piece of paper." And Thich Nhat Hanh will say something like, "I see the tree that made this paper, and I see the rain and the nutrients in the soil that nourished the tree that made this paper. And I see the cloud that made the rain," and so on and so forth. And that gets at this idea that everything is always changing. And it goes even a little deeper than that. I'll hold up this thing again. And am I holding up the same piece of paper? Not really. I mean, in the 30 seconds between those two times that I did that, things have changed. Some small bond in the fibers of the paper has degraded, or some charge on some of the atoms has shifted around. Maybe some of the chemicals in the paper have off-gassed a bit. It's not the same thing. There's a famous philosophical thought experiment called the Ship of Theseus. There's a nice story behind it. It's a Greek mythology. So the story goes that, if I get this right, on the island of Crete, there was a cruel and terrible tyrant named King Minos. And King Minos is the king with the labyrinth with the Minotaur in it. And every year he demanded tribute from Athens in the form of some of their children to feed to the Minotaur. Theseus, the hero in this story, he sails to Crete and defeats King Minos and the Minotaur and rescues the children, and becomes famous and whatnot. And so his ship becomes an object of kind of like a holy object, I guess, to the people of Athens. And they preserve it. As ships are made of wood, and wood deteriorates. So as the individual parts decay and rot, they put new pieces on there. And the thought experiment is that somebody at some point noticed that, we've replaced all of the original pieces of the ship. Is it fair to call it the Ship of Theseus anymore? Nothing is the same. So, is this still the same sheet of paper? It's pretty close, but it's not the same. And that the thought experiment really exposes the issue with using like names and solid objects for things. When we do that, I think we have to accept the fact that we're always going to be a little bit wrong. If I call this a sheet of paper again, I've referred to the same thing 4 times, but it's not the same thing. So I'm making some kind of error here. And that error is where dukkha comes in, where our suffering comes in. Because we believe the world is one way, and it's another. And also talk about the impermanence of sanya itself, and sanya being the kind of process of drawing pictures on the glass wall. We do change our views over time, and we do change how we think about things. It's not fully reflective of the world as it is, but we do change. I will share the story that when I was much younger, I was very into politics. Something that moved me a lot, and I had quite strong convictions about what political party was right and what things the country should do and that sort of thing. And I was very certain in my convictions until they changed. And then I found myself a member of a different political party. And I was quite certain of my convictions then until they changed again. So I went to a third political party that felt like home to me. And that's what we do. Our beliefs change over time, even when we feel very strongly about them. So there's impermanence in that sense too. So everything is always in flux. Absolutely everything that we can experience. Nothing is stable or static or still or safe from that characteristic. There's a story that's told about Suzuki Roshi, the famous founder of the San Francisco Zen Center. It said that one day he's teaching and someone asked a question during the Q&A period, and they say, I've been listening to your teachings for many years, but I still don't get it. Can you explain things simpler to me? Can you explain the Dhamma in one sentence? So the story goes, Suzuki Roshi thinks about it for a moment and says, everything changes. That was his summation of the Dhamma. So on the one hand, anicca is the source of our suffering. It's the reason we misunderstand, or one of the reasons we misunderstand the world. But on the other hand, it's also a gateway to enlightenment. And the interesting thing is that whether it's one or the other, it depends entirely on your perspective, on how you hold it. Whatever event or object that arises in consciousness that you see, if you push the impermanence away, if you don't acknowledge it, if you take it to be a stable thing, that will lead to suffering. But if that exact same thing arises and you hold that with the sense that this is impermanent, this is in flux, then that's a gateway to you waking up. It's entirely your perspective. And that's really our path. In this context of impermanence, it's to see impermanence everywhere in any of the ways that I mentioned, or any other ways you can see impermanence, and just see it from moment to moment and train the mind in that viewpoint. And even more than like seeing impermanence as a gateway to liberation, which is good and helpful. But I might suggest that you understand impermanence as a tool to address suffering in the moment. There are a number of different skillful responses when you see suffering, but impermanence is something that can cut through any suffering. It can cut through any hardness or solidness, because that hardness or solidness is not there. In chemistry, there's the concept of a universal solvent, something that can dissolve anything. Impermanence can dissolve anything too. Our suffering is around, seeing things as solid. It's either you see something you want and you want to make it solid to keep it, or you understand the world as being a certain way and you don't like it, but you're still understanding it as solid. And bringing impermanence to mind can dissolve those solid things, and therefore your suffering goes too. Yeah, so there's really two ways to see applying impermanence. I think you can, maybe the most straightforward or direct way is when you're feeling aversion or fear or some other some other unpleasant emotion, you can notice that it's not permanent. It goes away. It changes. You can also look into it and see what it's composed of, and therefore kind of break the spell. It's quite powerful if you get used to it. There's another way you can apply it too. It's to the things that we try and hold on to, the things that we like, the positive things. And it might not be immediately obvious why you would want to see the impermanence of something you like, something you want to keep. But when we think something is permanent, we take it for granted. We think we'll always have it. You can think about maybe someone you care about in your life that perhaps you see very often. Do those feel very special? Those kind of visits together? Perhaps not if you see them a lot. But what impermanence does is it brings the specialness back to the moment, because this moment is not static. It won't come again. And this thing that we like is not something we'll have forever. So it makes things special and precious. This is actually a Stoic practice too. There's a lot of overlap between Stoicism and Buddhism. The practice is to do whatever you're doing, even a mundane thing like walking to work or mowing the lawn, but do it with the understanding that this may be the last time you do that. This may be the last time you walk to work or mow the lawn or see your friend. I find that brings we can bring a pretty strong change of perspective. If you think about the last time you talked to somebody you loved, how would you have handled that conversation differently if if you would never have done that again, if that would be the last time? I imagine you might say something different or receive their presence differently. So we'll close with a story about Ajahn Chah related to that. Ajahn Chah is a kind of famous Thai meditation master. And so the story goes, he was teaching one time at a monastery, and after the talk, one of the monks noticed that the cup he was using to drink his water was a pretty fancy cup, and monastics typically don't have fancy things because that leads to attachment. So the monk asked him, why do you have this fancy cup? Ajahn Chah replied, you see this goblet? For me, the glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds my water admirably and sometimes even reflects the sun in beautiful patterns. If I should tap it, it has a lovely ring to it. But when I put this glass on the shelf and the wind knocks it over, or my elbow brushes it off the table and falls to the ground and shatters, I say, of course. When I understand that the glass is already broken, every moment with it is precious. And everything is like that glass. This body, this mind, this life, all the things that we might have or experiences we might encounter. All of that can be precious in that way because everything is impermanent and you only get to experience it the once. That's what I have to offer today. Thank you all for coming.